iGlobenews brings global views.
Welcome to iGlobeViews. My name is Diana Mautner-Markov. I am editor-in-chief of iGlobenews. Joining me is Suzanne Weigelin-Schwitzig, a world-renowned expert for all things related to China. Today is Labor Day, May 1st, and our topic for today is artificial intelligence and deindustrialization. Workers have nothing to lose but their jobs. For years, Europe has watched its industrial base decline. High labor costs, artificial intelligence, and overregulation have negatively affected the EU's industrial sovereignty. Labor Day is a good time to reflect on the future of workers. We live in a global economy governed by market forces. Protectionism of any kind disrupts the market, but it can also, if used wisely, protect national industries and its workforce. This is something President Trump tried to do with his tariff policies, and China has long since implemented. Europe has awakened to this reality. On March 4th, the EU Commission presented the Industrial Accelerator Act. This act makes access to the EU market conditional, monitors foreign investments, and imposes industrial requirements. The Commission hopes to halt the steady industrial decline which has befallen most of the EU's 27 member states. The Act introduces the concept of reciprocity and sends a clear message to the EU's trading partners. Countries that close off their public procurement markets will no longer enjoy free access to Europe. This Made in Europe principle would apply to decarbonized heavy industrial production such as aluminium and cement, green technologies such as wind turbines, electrolyzers, heat pumps, batteries, photovoltaics, nuclear power, and electric and hybrid vehicles, which would have to include 70% of locally sourced components in certain vehicles, excluding the battery, and minimum EU inputs for other projects. China has an outsized manufacturing footprint in key sectors, such as batteries, electric vehicles, solar powers, and critical raw materials, of course. All these sectors would be hit hard by this act. Beijing has already made clear it intends to retaliate against the act. If passed, Chinese businesses would be pushed out of the single market, and the act would bar Chinese firms from bidding for public contracts or equipping critical networks. Su Peng, Minister for Trade of the Chinese mission to the EU, on the 29th of April, stated, and I quote, "We hope the EU side will not underestimate China's firm resolve to safeguard our national interests." End of quote. The act requires EU governments to buy either within the EU or from, quote, trusted partners with whom the bloc has trade agreements, and this does not include China. For this act to have any effect, it will require an ability to monitor and to sanction those who violate, and that would also include the United States and China. So the existential question facing the EU, is the EU willing to protect its industrial power through tough measures or risk being industrially downgraded and bullied by China and by the US?
Well, from my point of view, I see that the EU is desperately trying to preserve its role in the global market by prohibiting competitors to enter the market or by protecting its own market. But from my point of view, this can only be half of what we need to do. Maybe it's even less than half of what we need to do. And in order to make my argument clear, I would like to remind you of the fact that around the year 2011, Germany had a brilliant idea. It was called Industry 4.0. And at the time, Germany was the propagator of this new idea. What does this new idea mean? It means that we replace people working in factories by robots working in factories. And why is this a brilliant idea? Because the demographic change in Europe and around the world forces us into inventing things that can actually replace human labor force, because we are lacking human labor force. We need human labor force in all kinds of fields. And so we can actually use robots in order to replace those workers that usually would work in factories. And as you just said, sort of traditional workers in times in which we are living at this moment cannot but lose their jobs. But they only lose their jobs if the owners of the companies actually invest into the future of their companies by replacing human labor force by robots. And by replacing human labor force by robots, the outcome is that you can boost your productivity. And this also implies that your prices for your products are lower than under usual conditions. So very interestingly, I was vice rector of research at the University of Vienna in the year 2011, when Germany used the Hanover Fair to actually sort of introduce the public to the idea of Industry 4.0. Immediately in Austria and around Europe, of course, also in Germany, discussions arose. What does it mean to implement this idea of robotizing manufacturing? Well, most of the people said, we can simply not imagine what life would be like and what production would be like if we replaced human labor by robots. So at the time, I made a suggestion to my colleagues and said, you know what? We organize a delegation to go to China, because I know that in China, they are already sort of building production facilities which actually produce on the level of Industry 4.0. They were enormously quick in understanding the value of this idea and sort of trying to implement it into a concrete production process. I remember vividly how my colleagues sort of looked at me and said, you know what? This vice rector is in Chinese studies and she always wants to attract attention to China. This is total nonsense. Nobody took up my idea. Of course, we didn't go to China, and we discussed for hours and hours and hours. And the result now is that China is the country in the world that actually implements in Industry 4.0 to the highest level. In all the international rankings, China is number one, whereas Germany is actually lagging behind and Europe is lagging behind. And this implies that this brilliant idea of implementing Industry 4.0 that was originally generated from Germany has now sort of traveled to China, where it is showing that China can actually sort of use this idea to solve quite a lot of problems, not only its demographic problem, but also, for example, the rise of wages and things like this. Whereas we in Europe are lagging behind. And I think that it is not such a very good idea to help an industry that is sort of lagging behind by protecting the market rather than giving more and more incentives to these industrial sectors to try to catch up with the highest level of modernization in the field of manufacturing. And for that reason, I'm a little bit dubious about all these measures, not to speak about the geopolitical implications, which are maybe not 100% what we need to do at this moment.
Very interesting, that example from Germany. So let me stay with the topic of artificial intelligence, because everybody is asking the question, how will that impact the job market in the future? And as we already know, artificial intelligence is influencing the labor force by automating routine cognitive and manual tasks, a trend that is said to accelerate by 2030. While it will take away specific jobs, particularly entry-level administrative and routine white-collar jobs, most evidence suggests AI will primarily reshape jobs rather than eliminate them entirely. Many factory-based jobs, though, will be replaced by robots, which is something you just mentioned. Within the next 10 years, Goldman Sachs Research estimates that 300 million jobs globally will be lost to automation by AI. In the US, AI can potentially automate tasks that account for about 25% of all work hours. So the question is, how will the developed countries in the EU and the US and other areas deal with this AI revolution, which is coming faster than we can think. Workers who are likely to be displaced from this knowledge industries by AI may be less suited for the kinds of labor that are most needed. Those will include, for instance, low skilled, low wage jobs, fast food workers, cleaners, home healthcare workers, for instance, and more skilled technical jobs of the kind provided by construction workers, engineers, electricians, and factory production workers. So just because new jobs will be created, it doesn't mean that the job you lose, which is maybe more a knowledge based job, you can't just immediately slide over and take over another job. And as you already mentioned, China is leading in world robotics. It just had a fair. We all saw the pictures, how this robot won the marathon. Of course, all the other robots collapsed along the way. But already now, China has robots which install wheels, dashboards, and windows for many of the top Chinese car brands, including BYD and NIO. The aim for many technologists is to develop a humanoid robot capable of performing factory labor, work that employs hundreds of millions of people worldwide. And we are on the cusp of this becoming a reality, as you already mentioned. In 2025, China announced a 100 billion fund for strategic technologies, including quantum computing, clean energy, and robotics. So my question to you is, will workers be eliminated or liberated by replacing them with robots? And will the AI robotics revolution be the next labor revolution? Where will this leave the workers? Jobless?
Well, thank you very much for this question. And I think it is quite interesting to see that if we want to give an answer to this question, we actually have to look at China. So in the past, we always thought that China was like 20, 30, 50, maybe even 100 years in the past in comparison to what our present situation was. And now we slowly but steadily realize that in some aspects, China is actually moving 10, 20 years ahead of us. So if we want to assess what kind of impact does a certain change, for example, in manufacturing have on the overall society, it's very interesting to see that if we look at China, we can already see what is happening today, which might be happening in the future in Europe or in the USA. And the question you just asked is a very relevant question for China. If we look at the fact that China is number one in digital manufacturing, it's already at a level of 72% of its manufacturing being produced by robots. The US, by the way, is also on a comparatively high level because of the trend of deindustrialization, which already made many workers in the US leave their industrial jobs and either become jobless or look for some other job. So the US is at 69%, which is comparatively high. India, actually with an enormously big population, sort of skipping the industry uh, 3.0 a level and is already jumping into the industry 4.0 level. It is already at 68% of its manufacturing, which of course with a relationship to India can be explained by the fact that although theoretically speaking, the labor force is enormously big, the standard or the level of education for the majority of this labor force is comparatively low. The elite education is very good in India, but the general education is bad. So for that reason, if they want to develop manufacturing and if they went the hard way, so first get your workers to the level that they can actually do the job, then this would take lots and lots of time. So they skip over this level and already enter the level of industry 4.0 before they do anything else. And for that reason, they sort of replace unskilled labor that would be sort of difficult for them to hire for advanced production by robots. Very interestingly, they are at 68%. Germany is at 57%. And of course, a driving force for Germany to do this is, on the one hand side, the demographic development. On the other hand, labor is extremely costly in Germany. And now with the raw materials becoming more and more costly, in addition to the labor force being very costly, there is lots of market incentive to actually robotize your manufacturing. So what does this mean? In all countries, we have a very interesting sort of situation at this moment, because on the one hand side, we have rising unemployment. On the other hand side, we don't have enough workers. So this means that we have a mismatch between what the labor market actually wants and what the people can offer in terms of skills they have acquired. So this is also very, very true for China. And interestingly, the biggest problem is not the low range work, but the high range work. So people, millions and millions, around 12 million people graduate from university every year in China, and they don't find jobs that actually match their expectations. Very interesting. So they stay at home because they are looking for a job that actually matches their expectation. They don't find the job, and they don't offer their labor force to some other job, which they might want to take over because they need to earn money. So their parents, these middle class parents that invest a lot into their children going through higher education in China and maybe even abroad, these parents are still rich enough to support their children, even though they already graduated from university and should have a job that feeds them. The parents support their children in not doing this, which is a very, very interesting sort of way of sort of going into a labor struggle with the employers, right? Because the employers are not offering the kind of wages that the parents and their kids who have just graduated from university expect, because of this enormously high investment with regard to money on the side of the parents and with regard to effort on the side of the young people, because there is this kind of mismatch. These young people are not offering their labor force anymore. And this implies that they're sitting around waiting for better wages to come. And at the other end, it's also very interesting to see that the so-called migrant workers in China, 450 million people who originally were born and raised in the countryside and then moved to the cities because there was such a need of labor in the cities. These people decided that they do not earn enough in the cities to cover their everyday expenses in the cities and at the same time support their families in the countryside. And the consequence of this situation is that they go back to the countryside and sort of work as a farmer at the subsistence level, which means that they only work as much as they need in order to sustain themselves and their families. And they have very, very low consumption and things like this. There are even some people who move to cities that are depopulated because in these cities, the cost for housing is extremely low. And so you can live in these cities, work online, and work only to a minimum so that you can cover your daily costs, but you do not want to earn more in order to buy a fancy apartment and a car and something in the future. So when we hear that China's internal consumption is not really working, it is very interesting. It's a way how the labor force actually struggles with potential employers for higher wages. And the way they do this is not by going on strike, but by refusing to offer their labor force on the labor market, which is a very interesting way. And I think that we will have to calculate on this also for the future of our countries. Very often these Chinese people, they invent things before we realize that we could be doing it the same way. And you see how there is, even in an authoritative country, where authoritarian country where we think, nobody can do what he or she likes, how they're actually following their interests by very, very interesting means. And I think this shows that actually workers who are confronted with, I would say, fundamental change of labor market that is going to arrive in future Europe in the next years to come, how they can actually sort of develop their capacity in sort of trying to ameliorate their position on the labor market, even though it looks as if they were in a very difficult situation.
Yes, and of course, China, like the US, are consumption-driven economies. And I remember there was this big push for Chinese people to take their vacation in China and spend more money in China, so to consume more. So that's also something very interesting. And the US, of course, is also a consumption-driven society, maybe not so much in Europe. But of course, for instance, in Germany, if you want to come back to Europe and bring Europe
Mhm.
back into the picture, Germany is, of course, the powerhouse of European economy, if you want to put it that way. But Germany's industrial base has been shrinking, and the
Mm.
automobile industry is the core of the German economy. And it has been on a downward spiral for almost a decade now. This sector is especially under pressure from Chinese EVs. Now, Volkswagen believes it has found the answer to its woes. Israeli defense company Rafael is in talks to take over Volkswagen's Osnabrück plant, as the automaker wants to phase out this plant by 2027. A cooperation between Volkswagen and Rafael Advanced Defense Systems would be a particularly prominent example of how the German automobile industry is increasingly turning to military production and is looking to join forces with the booming defense sector in Israel. But Germany is not alone here. This is just one example of many European companies that are actively cooperating with Israel defense systems, with major ties to producing, for instance, drone technology, artificial intelligence technology, and missile systems. And these are often funded by the European Defense Fund, very interestingly. And key partners also include, for instance, in Greece, Intracom Defense, in Belgium, OIP Systems, in the UK, partnered with Elbit Systems, and alongside significant arms components supplied by Italy and also by Germany. These companies produce AI driven cybersecurity and weaponized drone technology, brass ammunition cartridge cases, heavy machinery, including excavators, used in demolition of infrastructure, which we saw in Gaza, for instance. According to the latest EU data published on 29th of April, France, Germany, and Greece led EU arms sales to Israel in 2024, followed by Romania, the Czech Republic, and Finland. France exported 362 million, Germany 169 million, and Greece 114 million. So we're talking about a considerable amount of arms exports there. And this took place while Israel waged its ongoing genocidal war against the Palestinians in Gaza, of course, and while the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant were indicted for war crimes. France and Sweden have been outspoken critics of Israeli war crimes. It does beg the question of hypocrisy on the part of these and other countries. Is money king? Can these weapons factories save European industry? And are EU companies transferring critical weapons technology to Israel?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. I would say that maybe some of us are quite sort of astonished to see that politicians in Europe who used to argue that Europe is the peace continent of the world are now sort of switching to a narrative of war and destruction. And when we just listened to what you told us about the weapons industry and how it is developing in Europe, we understand that somehow we as people living in Europe need to sort of um, change in a new mode of accepting that the wealth of our societies will in future be built on destruction rather than on construction. Why is destruction always related to weapon industry? Because weapon industry can only develop if there is war going on. And if the war is not going on at this moment, they are preparing for a war to come. So if you switch from producing all kinds of things that are not related to war, to suddenly focusing on all kinds of things that are all related to war. This means that you're not only anticipating war, but you are actually sort of actively providing the kind of technology that your country and other countries in the world might need in order to go to war against yet another country. So these sort of so-called unending wars that some people say is, terrible and we don't want this. And if we want war only, like for 4 weeks or even only a weekend, like President Trump is telling us, well, this is only half of the story. The other half of the story is that obviously every war that you begin takes much longer than you had originally sort of told your public. And then it goes longer and longer and longer, and the number of weapons you need becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, and your weapon industry can actually develop into a major sector of your GDP. And I think that this is very unfortunate because, unfortunately, we know from historical experience that when countries start producing weapons, a war will come sooner or later. So this is, of course, a very, very sad sort of diagnosis that you just elaborated in front of us. So on the other hand, I think it is quite interesting to see that, if you talk about, for example, VW is now transferring its automotive production to China. So why do they do this? Because China is well prepared for these automobiles in several aspects. Technologically, as we just talked, production is now more, maybe not yet more productive than in China, but getting more and more productive because of robotization. At the same time, East Asia is an extremely vibrant market because East Asia has 3 countries with a very, very big population. That is China, that is India, and that is Indonesia. India and Indonesia, in comparison to China, is a very young population. So this implies that there is lots of dynamics in those societies. And this implies that if you move your production from Europe to China, you will not only have the workforce there, you will have the knowledge there, you will also have the consumers in East Asia. And if we go back to Europe and say, very interestingly, the weapons industry, it does not produce for the good of the people, it produces for wars, right? So this implies that sort of the industry in Europe is already calculating on the fact that our consumption capability will go down. Because if they did not count on weapons being, a growing sector of society, they would actually invest into things that we could consume, but we cannot consume weapons, right? So this implies that at the back of the mind of people who do position their investments, they already realize that the consumption capacity of people in Europe will go down. And those industries that have the capacity to actually move to Asia calculate that their investment is a good investment because the consumption capacity of people in Asia will go up and not down. Okay. So if we go into the direction you just sort of explained to us, our GDP will be growing because of the kind of weapons, for example, the kind of technology we are producing. But at the same time, there is reason to believe that the consumption capacity is calculated to go down. And this also implies that our standard of living is going to go down. Now, very interestingly, if you look at South Korea started developing its weapons industry already about 20 years ago. And their idea was that if they develop their weapons industry, then they have a new sector of their industry that will boost GDP growth. And if they can boost GDP growth, they can finance a social security system that is actually still in the making. In South Korea, in comparison to European standards, this is comparatively low. But now, if you look at the result of 20 years of this kind of policy, you will see that, for example, the low-age poverty in South Korea has risen, not shrunk, since the introduction of this policy. So their GDP is growing, but there is a growing sector in this society, and one must say that South Korea has the lowest fertility rate in the world. It has fertility rate of 0.76, so below 1, right? So China has 1 and is already struggling, right? We have a little bit over 1 and are already struggling, but South Korea has 0.76. So the number of elderly people is growing, whereas the number of young people is getting smaller and smaller. So they really have to sort of think about how can we sort of have the consumption as one pillar of our economy preserved if we have so many elderly people, and if so many of the elderly people don't have enough money to consume more than their daily necessities, right? So that is the reason why they thought, if we create a new sector in our economy, which is weapons industry, then the GDP growth will be sustained. If GDP growth will be sustained, we can spend more money for the pensions of the elderly, and then our society can sort of move on quite well. The result is the kind of money that is being given to the elderly population has not grown, which is why the number of people living under the poverty line, the number of elderly people in South Korea living under the poverty line, is growing year by year. So this shows that if you develop this one sector, it does not necessarily mean that you can actually sustain a societal system of social harmony, if we want to use this more Chinese way of putting this. So very interestingly, there must be something that tells us, this is not the solution to the problem, maybe. But nevertheless, I mean, European countries are not used to looking at other countries and trying to understand what kind of the development they have already gone through that we could look at in order to understand what is going to happen in our societies. We're not used to doing that. We always look at ourselves. I mean, even in the European Union, for someone in Germany to look at what is going on in Austria is already like, impossible to only imagine. But in some places, Austria is more advanced than Germany. So it would be a good idea for Germans to look at Austria. They don't do it. And I mean, this is even more true if you talk to people, that they need to look at China or maybe need to look at the US. Even at the US, they do not look. They always think they don't have this necessity. This is very, very dumb.
So, I mean, we're talking about how labor is not mobile, how capital, of course, is mobile. And when capital moves somewhere else, then, of course, labor loses its jobs. 24 Eurostat came out with the hourly labor costs in the EU. So there's a wide range. They range from 10.6 euros in Bulgaria, for instance, to 55.2 euros in Luxembourg. And the average cost in the EU was 33.5, so somewhere in the middle. In the EU, Belgium at 48.2, the Netherlands 45.2, Austria 44.5, France 43.7, and Germany 43.4 are among those so-called high-cost countries. Labor costs in the EU are lowest in Eastern Europe, namely in Bulgaria at 10.6, at Romania at 12.5, and Hungary at 14.1. Southern Europe has more modest costs, but there is still a big gap between the north and the south. For instance, Italy is 30.9, Spain at 25.5, Portugal 18.2, and Greece at 16.7. So all this to say that inflation is rising due to the rising price of energy, of course brought on first by Ukraine, then by the US-Israeli war on Iran and the subsequent closure of the Strait of Hormuz, which has caused the cost of living to go up. Energy prices have gone up, which means everything else goes up because everything needs energy. Unions in Western Europe have, of course, historically been quite strong, and they are pushing for inflation to be compensated in the next round of collective bargaining agreements. The higher wages could lead to plant closures, forcing industries to migrate to Southern and Eastern Europe, or maybe, as you already mentioned, to go to Southeast Asia or China, which is happening all the time. We read it in the news. Capital is mobile, workers are not. Will unions give industry the final blow and force them to move to lower wage countries? Are unions too powerful in Germany, Austria, and France?
Well, I don't know whether they are too powerful, because if I compare the situation today with when I was much younger in the 1960s and 70s and started to observe the society around me, I think at that time we had very violent strikes. We had very, articulate leaders of the labor movement, very articulate labor unions in all European countries. So in comparison to what I experienced, like when I was young, I think that our unions as of today are a comparatively low profile. And they actually, I think, as far as I understand, they struggle for getting support by their membership or by their potential membership because they're so low profile. And of course, they are right in the middle of a dilemma. On the one hand side, of course, they understand that their members want higher wages because of the problem of inflation. On the other hand, they also know that if wages go up and up and up and up, they will actually push for robotization, which implies that their members will actually lose their jobs to robots, or they will push for what you just mentioned, which is like the easier solution, to go from one country in the EU with very high wages to yet another country with low wages. And here again, we can actually look at China, which is very interesting. China has been sort of traveling with its products and production facilities for at least 20 years. So, for example, the textile industry that used to be extremely profitable in China has long ago started to move to other countries in Southeast Asia because the wages are much lower in Vietnam, in Laos, and Cambodia. And if you look at T-shirts today, you will not find, made in China so often as this was true for like maybe 10 years ago, but you will find made in Cambodia, made in Laos, made in Bangladesh. So, everywhere in the world, production is moving from one place to the other. And of course, if for example, textile production in China went from China to Vietnam, then the labor force had to be absorbed by other sectors of society, right? So if the industry as such is in a comparatively dynamic process, the kind of workplaces you lose, you can gain in other respects. I don't think that this will be the solution for Europe, as we see that the European sort of economy is transforming very slowly. Reactions are very, very sort of slowed down in comparison to other parts of the world, especially East Asia. And from that point of view, I would say that the labor unions are in a very, very delicate, if not to say precarious situation, because if they do this, then they might sort of generate a short-term positive effect for their membership, whereas they know very well that the long-term effect might be negative. So this implies that the kind of, class struggle that was sort of the recipe for labor unions in the past might not work out for the future anymore. And people might need to be very sophisticated in developing a strategy that can convince their membership, that can solve a short-term problem, and at the same time not create negative consequences for the future. So what we are actually sort of trying to solve here is, for example, if prices go up and up and up in every sector, then there is no way how you can avoid that your wages go up. There's no way that you can do this. And, we actually have a labor force that is trained to think very much in the categories of your individual interest. It's not as, in some countries in Asia where people think of their own interests, but at the same time, they're also proud of their country, they're proud of their company. So they have some kind of identity that is sort of split between what they think is good for themselves and what is good for their company, what is good for their country, maybe good for their city also. So I think it is very, very difficult in Europe to convince the labor force that maybe it would be good for your country and your company not to only think of your personal interests, because we've actually trained our young people to think in terms of personal interests, because we thought in the past that it is this personal interest that actually drives our consumption driven economy. Now we suddenly realize, oh, maybe this is not the solution to the problem. So I think we'll have to think very deeply and find a solution that goes beyond what we traditionally regarded as the solution to the problem.
So, to look beyond yourself to the good of society, if we look across the Atlantic to the US, if we want to bring them now into the picture, of course, that was one of the big campaign promises, Make America Great Again, of President Trump. His promise was he wanted to revive industrial production within the US because, of course, many of those jobs did go to China. And so he's fighting, and his tariff policies, of course, were a reflection of that, to bring those jobs back to the US. Americans want their blue collar jobs back. But of course, in the age of AI and robotics, even if industries return to the US, that does not necessarily mean that there'll be that many factory jobs, because maybe robots will be doing those jobs, as we already discussed before. Many factories are equipped with robots, and as time progresses, more and more factories will be equipped with more and more robots. So Trump's economic policies focus on tariffs, subsidies, and reshoring manufacturing to the US to address the impact of course, the humongous trade deficit which the United States has. At its core, economic nationalism prioritizes a nation's economic interests over the strength to strengthen national power and security. So as you said, to look beyond yourself, but to look at the country. Globalism, on the other hand, which has shaped the global economy ever since the end of World War II, is characterized by interdependence of economies, cultures, and populations, accomplished through cross-border trade in goods and services, technology, as well as the unrestricted movement of capital, people, and information. According to Trump, the age of free trade has ended. Is he correct?
Well, very interestingly, if we look at history, we see that when globalization reaches a certain level, that because of one reason or the other, I'm not a economic historian, I cannot explain this in detail, but I can observe this. So when globalization reaches a certain level, then a tendency towards deglobalization gets started. So before World War One, we had a very high level of globalization because of colonialism. World War One interrupted this tendency towards globalization and ignited a process of deglobalization. World War Two was yet another very interesting process towards deglobalization. And after World War One, the world split into basically two markets. One was the market that dominated by the Soviet Union, and the other one was the market dominated by the US and its allies. So this market was somewhat restricted in or limited in its capability to reach out for the whole world. And then you see how Germany is one of the first countries that sort of overcomes this demarcation line between the Soviet Union dominated market and the Western market. So very interestingly, sort of, the industry actually in Germany pushed towards Russia, towards the Soviet Union at the time, because people realized that with our wages rising at a comparatively high speed, we needed very inexpensive raw materials, and we got those raw materials from the Soviet Union. So this is, economically speaking, a very interesting phenomenon. But we can say that this new wave of globalization somehow started already in the 1970s, when Western European countries, especially Germany taking over the lead, sort of reached out to Eastern Europe. And so we have been going through a very, very long phase of globalization now. And somewhat we seem to have reached a level where there are political reasons, social reasons, and economic reasons to say, we don't want this to go any further. So what do we do in this situation? I think it is quite interesting. And there are recent publications discussing this issue, saying that the region now will become a very, very important unit for interstate trade. So the European Union will suddenly sort of go back to its original intentions of being a very big market that facilitates trade between its member states, and that this facilitating of trade between member states will be extremely important for the future. Why? Because we have a regional market that is big enough to sustain a lot of what we are actually needing in terms of our economy. So if we look, for example, at Austria, Austria has, I think, about 80% of its international trade is with other EU member states, right? So this implies that we have already an economy that is very much an economy that is part and parcel of a regional economy. Research says that this is going to be an overall trend, because these long logistic lines that we have to overcome, for example, in order to be able to import products from Asia to Europe, are getting more and more costly. I mean, one of the reasons why we could produce in Asia and consume in Europe was because transport was comparatively inexpensive. But now we see that these maritime lines are becoming more and more dangerous. And this implies that we'll have to pay higher and higher insurance rates, which again then tells us that it will be more and more costly to transport things from Asia to Europe. So because of that reason, we have to somehow arrange our supply chains within the region to make these logistical costs lower and lower. And to make these logistical costs lower and lower also implies that we are not paying such a very high toll to our climate, right? So from a climate change perspective, from a geopolitical perspective, sort of to concentrate on your regional economy and to try, for example, in the EU, to really sort of have a rational way of using the differences in wages, in knowledge, in skills, and in consumption capacity, I think will be sort of what we need for the future. And if we go back to this EU decision that you described to us at the beginning of our conversation, we might come to the conclusion that with regard to making the EU space a region by itself, that will be more and more important for the member states, maybe even more important than for any other, countries outside the EU. The logic might be this one. But I would still say that even though this logic might have a positive consequence on bringing the EU even closer together as a producing region and as a consuming region, at the same time, this can only work out if the EU is very innovative and competitive with regard to boosting its productivity and overcoming some tendencies of deindustrialization. Going to the US, I think it is quite interesting, as we just said, with regard to the robotization of the manufacturer industry. The US is ranked second behind China. So why is this so? Because if you deindustrialize, you actually make your workers shy away from manufacturing. So even if you want to invest into a certain sector of the economy that is related to manufacturing, then you suddenly realize that you don't have the workforce for this. So a very interesting case in point is TSMC. They are sort of more or less forced to invest in the US. And then you hear their CEO complaining that he simply cannot find the kind of workforce in the US that he needs for his company to run profitably in the US. So why does he not have the right workforce? On the one hand side, the number of engineers graduating from universities in the US is really low. And if engineers actually graduate from university in the US, they are very quickly attracted by the finance sector because engineers are known to be good in math. So your quality in math or your capacity in math can not only be translated in any kind of engineering job, but it can also be translated in a job in finance. And the job in finance will give you a higher pay than your job in the field of engineering, which is why the really low number of engineers that they create from graduates in the US. I'm not speaking of foreign students coming to the US. I'm speaking of graduates from the US. So this very low number then translates in an even lower number because people are being attracted by finance rather than by engineering jobs. But of course, this is sort of one problem that the US is confronted with. The second one is that for those jobs that you don't need engineers, but you need high skilled labor, you need a very, very good schooling system. But people who do not go to university, but end up going maybe to a community college, which is people from families that don't have the kind of income that they can afford to send their kids to universities, they are not very well trained by the US educational system. So if you want to reindustrialize, you need a workforce that has a general education on a comparatively high level. You don't have this in the US, right? Thirdly, you have a labor force that is used to a certain labor regime, right? In Asia, people are under enormous pressure because they are being raised through their educational system to always give their best and to work up to the expectations of somebody else. This is very, very interesting. No matter whether you look at Japan, you look at Taiwan, you look at South Korea, China, these countries sort of have a culture for people to assess their own succeed, not by their internal criteria, but by observing if they meet the expectation of other people. This implies that if your employer has the expectation that even though you have a shift of 8 hours a day, you theoretically can be called back to your company to work beyond 8 hours if this is necessary. And even if you have your weekend off, your employer has the expectation that you as the employee will come and fix a problem in your company, no matter whether it's Sunday night or Saturday evening. Even if you are enjoying a party with your friends, your employer calls you and says, there's a problem in our factory. Please come immediately. You will go. This is something that TSMC wanted to introduce to their workforce in the US, and the labor union said, no, this is a no-go zone. Right. So very interestingly, in order to reindustrialize your country, you have to make many, many, many changes, enormously big investments. And I think quite interestingly, what we observe in the US at this moment is that the team, which builds the entourage of President Trump, sort of looked very intensively at what Putin did in Russia. Because in Russia, we went through a rapid process of deindustrialization after the Soviet Union fell into pieces. And they had to rebuild their industrial capacities. And how did they do that? They accumulated the capital they needed for reindustrialization by becoming a sort of raw material export intensive country. And what do we watch at this moment in the US? That they're exporting more and more and more and more raw materials, especially oil and gas, because this seems to be one way to at least accumulate the kind of capital you need so that you not only invite people from the outside to invest into your reindustrialization, but you yourself also have the capacity to invest into this sector. A very interesting sort of hidden agenda behind what Donald Trump and his team is trying to achieve. But as I just said, they're confronted with enormous problems. Once a country is deindustrialized, it seems to be extremely difficult to reindustrialize it.
Yes, so very interesting comparison here with the Soviet Union, and of course with this war, this hot war going on in the Middle East. American oil and gas has all of a sudden become even more attractive. So that's something that is positive for the U.S. in this catastrophe which is unfolding in the Middle East at the moment. Regarding the trade schools, of course, Austria and Germany have a wonderful system of trade schools. I have read that in the US, the administration does want to push trade schools as well. I think they do realize that that's something the US is really sorely lacking. And of course, this cost of education in the US is just unbelievable compared to, for instance, Europe, where most universities, or you can get a very good education for very little, if not free. Whereas in the US, your family has to go into incredible debt so that they can educate you. And then, as you mentioned, this difference between this Confucian ideology, which Asia has, and this Western ideology, which is centered on, the feel-good ideology of the individual and not the society. That's also a big difference. But one thing that globalism has led to is unprecedented wealth. From China to Europe to the US, there have never been as many billionaires as today. While wealth is concentrated in the hands of just a few, the middle class is increasingly under pressure. Billionaires have never before dominated the world, driving politics, policies, equity markets, and AI hysteria. According to Forbes, a record 3,428 entrepreneurs, investors, and heirs make this year's world's billionaire list. That's 400 more than in 2025. Now, put another way, the planet added more than one new billionaire every day over the past 12 months. Even more astonishing is the amount of money involved. As a group, the billionaire class is $4 trillion richer than in 2025. Their combined wealth now stands at a record of 20.1 trillion. That's just an amazing number. The average billionaire's fortune is 5.8 billion with a B, up from 5.3 billion with a B in 2025. 15 of the 20 richest people in the world live in the US, the richest, of course, being none other than Elon Musk. Capital is mobile. It can move to any jurisdiction, which offers the best profit at the least regulations. The West, especially Europe, has provided its working class many benefits, including social, educational, health, and pension benefits. With the billionaire class getting more and more powerful and these industry captains controlling the fate of millions of workers, how can highly socialized societies keep industries if the cost of their workforce is simply not competitive?
Yeah, well, I think that kind of summarizes everything we have discussed so far in today's conversation. So the only way you can do this is by boosting productivity. You can actually sort of solve a problem, at least partially. It's not the problem of equity and equality cannot be solved by boosting productivity. But if you want to solve anything, then you need to sort of look at the productivity problem. And for example, if we go back to the beginning of our conversation talking about robots replacing human labor, so people calculate that a robot, if used appropriately, and if well developed, can actually boost productivity 5 times in comparison to an individual human worker. So I think this is something we really have to think about. And at the same time, I think we have to think about how our societies actually develop new criteria of estimating its own success, the success of its members, and so that every single person in our society sort of can think about him or herself in a different way. So, for example, for a very long time, of course, a country that built its wealth on industry would give very high estimation to people who work in factories, no matter whether they're low skilled workers or whether they are managers of the company. But maybe now we have to realize that if our societies don't want to run into enormous troubles, we have to learn how to help ourselves, how to have a high estimation for people who are willing to help other people. I mean, it's incredible from my point of view to see that, for example, nurses think that their work is not of high esteem in society. Although, I mean, everybody knows that every once in a while we are sick and sometimes we need a nurse to help us. So why do we not hold their work in very high esteem? People who help us raise our children in kindergartens, in schools, they should be people whose work is in very high esteem. But unfortunately, our societies don't do this. People who help you if you're in a car accident, to get out of this terrible situation, they're being scolded at by other people. Why is this so? So we see that there is sort of a very, very strange sort of climate in our society. And I think that if we are going to change into, for example, having more industry jobs done by robots rather than by humans, then we will have to think about what can these humans do, and they will only take over other jobs and be happy with those other jobs if society learns to actually have a high esteem for for work in the service sector rather than the manufacturing sector. And I think this is quite interesting because, for example, China was a society in the 1970s when I first went there that had a very, very low level of, service sector because everybody was in manufacturing, either in agriculture or in industry. But the society very rapidly changed into a society that could only sustain very intensive work in industry, in management, in schools, and so on and so forth, if they had a very big workforce that would actually provide all kinds of services. And if you look at the people, how they treat those AIs, what they are being called in China, when they come to their homes, you'll see that they actually have a lot of respect for these people. So these people know that they're much poorer than the people they work for, and they don't get the same kind of wages that these people get. But although their wage is low, they are met with a high level of respect, which is why they're actually willing to work for you. At the time, I mean, in the 1990s and the early 2000s, demand for these people was extremely high. So the employer, the private employer, had to make sure that your IE is actually very happy so that she wouldn't change and go to somebody else who is nicer. Right. So from this point of view, I think we can also learn from China that if you change sort of the organization of your industry, you will also have to change attitudes among the members of your society towards the future of labor organization that our societies will be confronted with.
Well, many ideas on how to keep jobs in your own society, give them more recognition for what they do. And hopefully, workers will not lose their jobs because of artificial intelligence and deindustrialization. I think that is an issue which is going to be following us for quite a long time. Is there anything you'd like to say to our viewers before we end our discussion?
Thank you very much for the conversation, which is somewhat out of my field of expertise, but as you might have realized, I'm quite interested in these kind of questions. And so I was very glad to have this opportunity to talk to you about these issues. And I think today, being Labor Day, this was a very, very good topic for you to choose for our conversation. And I hope that our listeners will be interested in what we had to say.
I hope so too. And I think May 1st was the perfect day to have our conversation on AI and deindustrialization and offer some food for thought on today's Labor Day. For our listeners and our viewers, thank you very much for tuning in to another episode of iGlobeViews. Please remember to like, follow, subscribe, and also to write a Spotify recommendation so that others can find us. The copyright for this is iGlobe News.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.